Have you ever noticed that the people who seem to move through life with the least visible effort are not the people who have experienced the least difficulty? They are not the ones who have been spared loss or failure, or the particular kind of confusion that comes from not knowing whether what you are doing is leading anywhere worth going. In fact, if you look closely at the people who carry a quality of ease and steadiness through circumstances that would unsettle almost anyone else, you often find that they have been through more difficulty than most, not less. What is different about them is not what they have experienced, but how they have learned to hold what they experience. The relationship they have developed with uncertainty itself. Carl Jung spent decades investigating this phenomenon, not in the abstract, not as a theoretical question about the nature of optimism or resilience, but as a clinical and philosophical question about what it actually means to live in genuine alignment with the deepest layers of one's own psychological being. What he found, again and again, in the lives of the people who came to him in crisis and in the long arc of his own personal development, was something that sounds almost too simple when stated directly, but turns out, on examination, to be one of the most demanding and most transformative orientations a human being can develop. The orientation of acting as if everything always works out. This is not the same as pretending. It is not the same as denial, or naive optimism, or the forced cheerfulness of a person who has decided to refuse all difficult feelings in favor of a performance of positivity. Jung had no patience for that. He was a man who took suffering seriously, who understood darkness as a genuine and necessary dimension of the psychological life, who believed that the person who has never encountered their own shadow is a person who has not yet become truly conscious. The orientation he is describing is something quite different from the avoidance of difficulty. It is a particular relationship with difficulty, a way of meeting what is uncertain and what is difficult from a position of fundamental trust in the process itself. Trust not that everything will feel good, but that everything that happens, including what is hard and painful and confusing, belongs to a process that is oriented towards something real. If you have ever found yourself frozen by uncertainty, unable to act because you could not be sure the action would lead somewhere good, if you have ever spent months or years waiting for a guarantee that never came before you allowed yourself to fully commit to the life you were actually living, this video is for you. Not to tell you that everything will be easy, but to explore, through the depth of Carl Jung's understanding of the human psyche, why acting as if everything always works out may be the most psychologically honest and most genuinely courageous stance available to a human being who takes life seriously. Number 1. The unconscious is oriented toward wholeness. One of the most fundamental and most consistently misunderstood aspects of Jung's entire body of thought is his understanding of the unconscious. Most people, if they have any sense of what the unconscious means at all, understand it primarily as the repository of what has been repressed. The unwanted contents, the difficult memories, the unacceptable impulses that the conscious mind has found too threatening to acknowledge and has therefore pushed below the surface where they continue to operate invisibly. This is not wrong, but it is radically incomplete as a description of what Jung understood the unconscious to be. For Jung, the unconscious is not only a storehouse of what the ego has refused. It is an active, intelligent, purposeful layer of the psyche that is always oriented toward a specific end. That end is wholeness. The unconscious, in Jung's understanding, is always working to move the total person, conscious and unconscious together, toward a more complete expression of what they potentially are. It is doing this whether the conscious mind cooperates or not, whether the ego understands what is happening or not, whether the circumstances of a life look, from the outside, like progress or like collapse. This is a genuinely radical claim, and it is the foundational claim on which the entire possibility of acting as if everything always works out rests. Because if the unconscious is genuinely oriented toward wholeness, then the events of a life, including the events that feel most like failure, most like loss, most like the things that should not have happened, and that you would have prevented if you had had any power to prevent them, are not random. They are not meaningless. They are not simply misfortunes to be survived and gotten past as quickly as possible. They are part of a process that is intelligent, a process that knows something the conscious mind does not yet know, a process that is, in the fullest and deepest sense, on your side. Jung wrote that the unconscious does not deceive. What it offers in dreams, in symptoms, in the strange synchronicities that occur when a person is at a genuine crossroads in their life, is always oriented toward the truth of what the person most needs to encounter. Not the most comfortable truth, not the most immediately manageable truth, but the most real truth, the one that, if followed, leads toward greater wholeness rather than away from it. When you begin to genuinely understand this, something in the way you hold uncertainty begins to shift. Not because uncertainty becomes comfortable, not because you stop wanting things to be different from how they are, but because a new possibility opens, a possibility that was not available when the unconscious was simply the enemy, simply the darkness, simply the thing to be managed and controlled. The possibility that what is happening, even when it is painful and confusing and nothing like what you had planned, is not working against you. It is working for you, in a direction and at a depth that the conscious mind cannot yet see from where it currently stands. Number 2. What anxiety about outcomes is actually costing you. There is a particular form of paralysis that is extremely common and extremely rarely named for what it is. It is the paralysis that comes from requiring certainty before action, the state of waiting to feel sure before committing, waiting to know that it will work out before investing fully, waiting for a guarantee that the path leads somewhere good before allowing yourself to actually walk it. Most people who live in this paralysis do not experience it as paralysis. They experience it as prudence, as reasonable caution, as the responsible thing to do in a world that is genuinely uncertain and genuinely capable of disapproval and genuinely likely to offer pain alongside whatever else it offers. But Jung would have recognized this immediately as a form of unconscious resistance, not to the specific circumstances being avoided, but to the fundamental condition of being alive, which is that no certainty is available in advance, that the guarantee never comes before the commitment, that the path does not reveal itself fully until you have walked far enough along it to see what was previously invisible from your starting position. The cost of requiring certainty before action is enormous, and it is almost entirely hidden from the person paying it. What is lost is not merely the opportunities that were never taken. What is lost is something more interior and more consequential. It is the relationship with your own deep process. When you consistently refuse to act without a guarantee, you are consistently refusing to trust the part of yourself that knows more than you know consciously. You are consistently choosing the management of fear over the engagement with life, and over time, this refusal does not merely prevent specific outcomes. It hollows out the capacity for genuine aliveness itself. The person who has spent years avoiding uncertainty has often also spent years avoiding reality, because reality is, at every point and without exception, uncertain. Jung described what he called the night sea journey, the mythological image of the hero who enters darkness without knowing what will be found there, or whether return is possible. He used this image not as a romantic metaphor, but as a genuine description of what the psychological life requires at its most demanding moments. The willingness to enter the uncertain, to go forward without the guarantee, to act as though the journey itself, regardless of where it leads, is worth taking. Not because the destination is guaranteed, but because the alternative, the refusal to enter, costs something that cannot be recovered. Anxiety about outcomes is not the enemy. In Jung's understanding, it is information. It is pointing to something that needs to be looked at, acknowledged, understood. But when it is allowed to govern action, when it becomes the final authority on what is worth attempting and what is not, it has taken on a role it was never designed to serve. The purpose of anxiety in the psychological life is to alert, not prohibit. To flag what deserves attention, not to permanently foreclose what deserves engagement. Learning to hear anxiety without being governed by it is one of the most important developmental tasks Jung identified, and it begins with the recognition that acting without certainty is not the same as acting recklessly. It is the most honest response available to the genuine condition of being human. Number 3. Synchronicity and the intelligence behind events. In 1952, Jung published one of the most unusual and most challenging ideas of his long career. He called it synchronicity, and he defined it as the meaningful coincidence of events that have no causal relationship, but that nonetheless appear connected by a significance that cannot be reduced to chance. Two things happen at the same time, or in close proximity, that are not caused by each other, but that speak to each other in a way that cannot be ignored by the person experiencing them. Jung did not offer synchronicity as a mystical claim or a retreat from the empirical commitments of his clinical work. He offered it as a genuinely observed phenomenon that the existing categories of psychological explanation could not fully account for. He had seen it too many times, in too many different forms, with too many different people, to dismiss it as coincidence. The patient who dreamed of a specific symbol the night before encountering it unexpectedly in waking life. The person who, in the midst of a major life decision, encountered a stranger who said exactly what needed to be said at exactly the moment it needed to be heard. The book that fell open to exactly the passage that addressed exactly the question that had been unanswerable until that moment. Jung's interpretation of synchronicity was not that these events were caused by some external force or supernatural agency. His interpretation was that they pointed to a dimension of reality in which the interior life and the exterior world are more deeply connected than the conventional understanding of causality can account for. That when the psyche is in genuine motion, moving towards something important, the outer world sometimes responds in ways that cannot be predicted, but that can be recognized as meaningful by the person with the capacity to recognize meaning. What does this have to do with acting as if everything always works out? Everything. Because synchronicity is Jung's most specific and most empirically grounded argument for the claim that there is an intelligence operating in and through the events of a life that is not reducible to the intentions of the conscious ego, an intelligence that arranges things, not in a way that guarantees comfortable outcomes, but in a way that consistently serves the process of becoming. That brings what is needed, when it is needed, in forms that the ego could not have anticipated and would not have chosen, but that turn out in retrospect to have been exactly right. When you begin to notice synchronicity in your own life, when you begin to develop the quality of attention that allows you to recognize the meaningful coincidences that were perhaps always there, but went unnoticed because you were not looking for them, something begins to change in the relationship with uncertainty. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because evidence begins to accumulate that the uncertainty is not empty, that there is something there, something oriented towards something real, something that can be trusted not to produce pleasant outcomes on demand, but to serve the genuine process of your becoming. Number 4, the shadow of pessimism and what it protects against. There is a particular kind of person who would hear the phrase, act as if everything always works out, and feel immediately resistant. Not because they are lacking in intelligence or in genuine psychological insight, but because they have learned, through real experience, that things do not always work out, that people suffer, that genuine losses occur, that hope extended too quickly can become the raw material of a pain that might have been avoided. This resistance is not wrong. It is pointing at something real, and Jung would have been the last person to dismiss it. In Jungian terms, this resistance is the shadow of the optimistic orientation. The shadow, as Jung understood it, is not the enemy of the legitimate quality it accompanies. It is the necessary counterweight, the unconscious complement, the dimension of truth that the dominant orientation tends to overlook. And the shadow of acting as if everything always works out is the reality of genuine suffering, genuine loss, genuine things that do not work out in any sense that can be retrospectively understood as meaningful or necessary. Jung took this shadow seriously. He did not believe that depth psychology offered any escape from the reality of genuine pain. His own life included losses and periods of profound psychological darkness that he did not romanticize or explain away. What he believed, and what he found consistently confirmed in the clinical work of his long career, was that the way a person holds their pain makes an enormous difference to what becomes possible on the other side of it. Not whether pain occurs, but how the psyche relates to the pain that does occur, the pessimistic orientation, the one that protects against disappointment by refusing to invest fully in any outcome, by maintaining a consistent low-level expectation that things will not work out, by staying at a careful distance from the full experience of hope, does offer genuine protection against a specific form of pain, the pain of disappointed hope, but it extracts a very high price for that protection. The price is the quality of aliveness itself, the depth of investment in life, the willingness to be genuinely moved by what is happening, which is inseparable from the willingness to be genuinely pained by what does not work out. Jung believed that the person who has genuinely integrated their shadow, who has looked honestly at the reality of loss and the possibility of failure and the genuine uncertainty of all outcomes, and who can still choose the orientation of fundamental trust, is not naive. They are psychologically mature in a way that the person who has not taken that risk cannot yet be. They have chosen presence over protection, genuine engagement over managed distance, the full experience of living over the comfortable numbness of preemptive disappointment. Number 5. Acting as if as a discipline of inner alignment. It is important to understand what acting as if everything always works out actually requires in practice. Because it is not a passive state. It is not a mood or a feeling or a spontaneous emotional orientation that some people have and others do not. It is a discipline, a daily and sometimes hourly practice of bringing the conscious mind into alignment with the orientation that the unconscious, in Jung's understanding, already has, an orientation toward wholeness, toward what is genuinely necessary, toward the process of becoming rather than the management of outcomes. What this looks like in practice is something more subtle and more demanding than simply telling yourself that things will be fine. It looks like making the choice, when you encounter an unexpected obstacle, to ask what this is asking of you, rather than immediately moving to resist or circumvent it. It looks like the practice of remaining curious about what a difficult circumstance is pointing toward, rather than exclusively focused on how to make it stop. It looks like cultivating what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between what you want to happen and what is actually happening, without collapsing into either denial or despair, but remaining present to both until something new becomes possible that was not visible from either pole alone. A woman I know spent several years in a professional situation that felt deeply wrong, but that she could not immediately leave for practical reasons. The conventional advice she received was focused on either making the best of the situation or planning her exit as efficiently as possible. What Jung's framework offered her was something different. The question of what the situation was asking her to develop that she had not yet developed. Not as a way of making the situation acceptable, but as a way of remaining genuinely present to it rather than simply enduring it from behind a wall of managed distance. What she found over the months that followed was that the very qualities she had to develop in order to survive the difficult situation were exactly the qualities that made the next chapter of her professional life possible, in ways she had not anticipated. The situation had not worked out in the way she had hoped when she entered it. But it had worked out, just not in the direction she had been looking. This is the heart of what acting as if everything always works out actually means. Not that every specific outcome you desire will arrive in the form you desire it, but that the process is reliable, that the intelligence operating through events, including the difficult ones, is genuinely oriented toward what you need even when it is not oriented toward what you want, and that your job in the face of this is not to manage outcomes, but to remain genuinely present to the process, to keep showing up, to keep acting as though the next step is worth taking even before you can see where it leads. Number 6. Trust as the foundation of psychological courage. Jung defined courage not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to act in the presence of fear toward what you have identified as genuinely important. This is a distinction that matters enormously for the practice of acting, as if everything always works out. Because this practice does not require the elimination of doubt or the suppression of the fear that things might not go as hoped. It requires something much more difficult and much more real, the willingness to act anyway, to commit to the process anyway, to trust the underlying intelligence of life's unfolding anyway, even when the surface of events offers no visible confirmation that the trust is warranted. This kind of trust is not optimism in the conventional sense. It is not the belief that good things will happen because you deserve them, or because you have worked hard enough, or because the universe owes you a favorable outcome. It is something more fundamental than that. It is the experientially grounded conviction that the process itself, the process of living, of encountering what life actually brings, of allowing that encounter to develop and deepen and change you in ways you could not have planned, is a process worth trusting. Not because it will be comfortable or because it will produce what you currently think you want, but because it is the only process available for becoming more fully real, more fully yourself, more fully alive in the way that Jung believed every human being is called to be alive. The development of this trust is not instant. It is built over time, through the accumulation of experience with the process itself, through noticing, retrospectively, how the things that seemed most like failures or detours often turned out to be necessary turning points, through developing a relationship with your own unconscious that allows you to recognize its intelligence, even when you cannot consciously understand where it is leading, through the practice, repeated and imperfect and genuinely demanding, of choosing presence over protection, engagement over managed distance, the full aliveness of acting as if things will work out over the hollow safety of holding yourself back until certainty arrives. Number 7. Living forward in the absence of guarantees. There is a phrase that the philosopher Kierkegaard used that Jung would have recognized immediately. Life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. You cannot know, while you are living something, what it will look like from the other side. You cannot see, while you are in the middle of something that feels like loss or failure or confusion, what it is preparing for you that will only become visible later. You can only live forward, into the uncertainty, into the not yet known, into the process that is doing something you cannot yet fully see. Acting as if everything always works out is, at its deepest level, the choice to live forward with genuine commitment, rather than with the protective half-presence of the person who refuses to invest fully, because they cannot guarantee the return. It is the choice to bring yourself completely to what is actually happening, rather than saving yourself for a future that promises to be safer or clearer, or more certainly heading in the right direction before you give it your full presence. Jung made this choice consistently throughout his own life. When he broke with Freud, at a point when Freud's support had been among the most significant forms of professional validation available to him, he did not know what would follow. He entered a period of profound inner uncertainty that he later described as the most disorienting years of his adult life. He did not know, during those years, that the work being done in the interior darkness would eventually produce some of the most significant psychological insights of the 20th century. He only knew that it was necessary, that the process was real, that something genuine was happening, even when it was not legible from the outside. He acted as if it would work out, not because he had evidence that it would, but because he had enough relationship with his own deep process to trust that the process was oriented towards something real, even when he could not see what that something was. This is the deepest form of what acting as if everything always works out requires. Not the absence of doubt, not the performance of confidence, not the suppression of fear or difficulty, or the genuine uncertainty of not knowing how things will go, but the willingness to remain genuinely present to the process of your own life. To keep moving forward even when you cannot see ahead. To trust, on the basis of whatever genuine relationship you have developed with your own deepest being, that the intelligence operating through the events of your life is worth trusting, that the process is worth the full commitment of your presence, that everything, all of it, the celebrated and the difficult, the clear and the confusing, the things that worked out as you hoped, and the things that did not, is working towards something real, and that this something real, even when it remains invisible for long stretches of your life, is worth acting as though it is there, worth living toward, worth bringing your whole self to, because it is the only thing that actually is there, underneath the uncertainty and the not knowing, at the deepest layer of a life being genuinely lived. It is the process of becoming yourself, and it is in the end everything. If this video touched something in you that you have been circling around without quite being able to land on, if the idea of trusting the process feels less like a platitude and more like a genuine possibility you have not yet fully committed to, leave a word in the comments. One word that names what you would do differently if you truly acted as if everything always worked out. Because sometimes naming it is where the trust begins, and if you want to continue exploring what it means to live from the deepest layers of your own being, rather than from the managed surface of a life, held at careful distance from itself, stay close to this work, not because the path will be guaranteed, but because there is no other path that is actually yours. There is something worth dwelling on more carefully before we move toward the end of this exploration, because the idea of trusting a process you cannot see, of acting as though an intelligence is at work, even when the evidence available to the conscious mind does not confirm it, sounds, when stated plainly, like a leap that requires more than most people are willing to make. It sounds, frankly, like faith. And for many people whose relationship with uncertainty has been shaped primarily by experiences of genuine loss and genuine disappointment, faith is a word that has been emptied of its content by previous encounters with promises that did not materialize. Jung understood this. He was not asking people to believe something they had no experiential basis for believing. He was asking something more precise and more honest than that. He was asking people to pay closer attention to what they had already experienced, but perhaps not yet fully processed, because in almost every life, if the attention is honest enough and patient enough, there is evidence available. Not evidence that the process will be comfortable or that specific outcomes will arrive on schedule, but evidence of a different kind. Evidence that what seemed, in the moment of its occurrence, like a loss or a failure or a wrong turn, later revealed itself as something that had been necessary, something that had prepared what followed, something that could not have been planned but that, in retrospect, belonged. This retrospective recognition is not nostalgia or rationalization. It is the conscious mind beginning to see what the unconscious was doing all along. It is the gradual development of what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the capacity to look at events not only for their literal significance, but for what they are pointing toward at a deeper level. The capacity to ask not only what happened, but what it means. Not only what was lost, but what it made possible. Not only where the path went, but what the detour was teaching. This is a learnable capacity. It is not a gift that some people have and others do not. It is a practice. The practice of looking at your own life with enough patience and enough honesty to begin to see the patterns that are not visible at the level of individual events. The patterns that only emerge when you look at a longer arc, when you are willing to ask, of the most difficult chapters of your history, what they were doing, not what they felt like, not whether they should have happened, but what they were doing, what they were building in you that nothing easier or less painful could have built. A man I know lost a position he had worked toward for nearly a decade, in circumstances that felt deeply unjust and that left him, for many months, unable to see any forward direction. He had planned his professional life around this position. Its loss seemed to close the very path that had given his working years their sense of direction and meaning. He spent a long period in genuine grief and genuine confusion, not performing recovery but actually sitting with the difficulty of not knowing what came next. What came next, when it finally became visible, was something he could not have found without the loss. Not because the loss was good in any simple sense. Not because the injustice of the circumstances became less real when the next chapter opened, but because the path that opened was one that suited him more deeply and more genuinely than the one that had closed. And it would not have become available to him if he had remained on the path he had planned. The loss had worked out, not comfortably, not quickly, not in any way that erased the reality of what had been painful, but genuinely, in the deepest sense, it had worked out. This is not a story with a moral about how suffering always leads to something better. Some suffering leads to further suffering. Some losses are simply losses. Jung was not sentimental about this, but he did believe, and the clinical evidence of his long career supported him, that the psyche that maintains its orientation toward wholeness, that does not collapse into cynicism or into the defensive posture of requiring certainty before engagement, that keeps acting as if the process is oriented toward something real, even when the surface of events does not confirm it, is a psyche that creates the conditions in which genuinely better outcomes become possible, not guaranteed, but possible in a way they cannot be for the psyche that has closed itself against the uncertainty that genuine living requires. Acting as if everything always works out is not a claim about how the world is arranged. It is a claim about how to inhabit your own life, about the quality of presence and commitment and genuine engagement that allows whatever the world offers, including the difficult things, to be received and processed and integrated in a way that serves the ongoing work of becoming yourself. It is the practice of remaining genuinely available to your own experience, even when your experience is confusing or painful or nothing like what you had planned. Jung believed this was the most important practice available to a human being who takes seriously the question of what their life is actually for, not the achievement of specific outcomes, not the accumulation of markers of external success, not the management of circumstances so that they never deviate too far from what was planned, but the genuine daily, often difficult commitment to remaining present to the process that is your life, to acting as though that process in all its unpredictability and all its genuine difficulty is fundamentally oriented towards something worth trusting, because it is, because you are, and because the trust itself, practiced consistently and honestly over time, is what makes it increasingly true. There is one more thing that needs to be said about this, and it is perhaps the most practically important thing of all, because everything we have explored in this conversation remains, until it is actually practiced, a set of ideas about how to live rather than a way of living. And the gap between ideas about how to live and actually living that way is not closed by understanding, it is closed by action. Specifically by the small and daily and often unglamorous act of choosing, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, to act as if things will work out even when you do not feel certain that they will. This looks different for different people and in different circumstances. For one person, it is sending an email they have been drafting for weeks, but not sending because they are not sure how it will be received. For another, it is committing to a creative project whose outcome is uncertain without first waiting to know that it will succeed. For another, it is allowing themselves to fully invest in a relationship rather than maintaining the protective distance of someone who has not yet decided whether they can afford to be hurt. For another, it is simply getting up in the morning and engaging with the day's actual contents rather than the day's imagined threats. In each case, what is being practiced is the same thing. The willingness to act without the guarantee, to bring full presence to a situation whose outcome is uncertain, to behave not in the performed and self-conscious way of someone acting a role, but in the genuine and organic way of someone who has actually developed a relationship with the intelligence operating through their life. As though what is happening is part of a process worth trusting, as though the next step is worth taking even before the step after that is visible, as though, in the end and in the deepest sense, everything works out, not because it always feels like it is working out, not because the difficult chapters are not difficult, not because the losses are not real, or the confusion is not genuine, or the fear that things might not go well is not a reasonable response to the genuine uncertainty of being alive, but because the alternative, the life lived from behind the protection of managed distance and preemptive disappointment, and the consistent refusal to invest fully until certainty arrives, is not actually safer. It is just emptier. It produces less pain of the specific kind that comes from disappointed hope, but it produces more pain of the deeper kind that comes from having stood at the edge of your own life and refused to enter it fully. Jung believed that the life fully entered, with all the risk and all the genuine uncertainty and all the real possibility of pain that full entry requires, is the only life that produces the kind of meaning that makes a human existence feel worth the living of it. Not the life successfully managed from a safe distance. The life fully inhabited, with everything that implies, including the trust that is required to inhabit it fully, including the practice of acting as if everything always works out as the daily and concrete expression of that trust, including the understanding that this practice is not a claim that the world is arranged to your convenience, but a commitment to showing up for your own life with the full presence and the genuine engagement that allows the world's arrangement, whatever it turns out to be, to actually serve the ongoing work of becoming yourself. That is what Jung was pointing toward. That is what acting as if everything always works out actually means, when it is understood not as a slogan or a positive affirmation, but as a serious and demanding and genuinely transformative orientation toward the life you are actually living. Bring it with you. Practice it in the small moments and the large ones, and notice over time what begins to change. Not in the world's willingness to arrange itself to your preference, but in your own relationship with the uncertain, the difficult, and the ongoing, never fully finished, always worth continuing process of becoming who you are.